Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger. Well, this is going to be a long one. We've got 48 slides. This is the PowerPoint to Chapter 6 in the Van Wormer text, Addiction Across Lifespan. So for those of you that have taken developmental psychology, lifespan psychology, or Psych 100, you're probably familiar with Erik Erikson's stages. He believed that we would have these tasks to complete and that we could become stuck in a previous stage if we weren't able to overcome that task. It's similar to Freud's psychosexual rules. These are the psychosocial stages. Erikson didn't believe that Freud was extensive enough with that, so he took it and expanded upon it. So our first stage is trust versus mistrust, where we're learning if we cry, our needs going to be met. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is the toilet age. Are we shamed for things? Are we allowed to experiment a little bit? How are basic things being held? Initiative versus guilt. This is where we're starting to play and learn how to socialize. Industry versus inferiority. Again, school age, we're learning to individuate ourselves a little bit at this point in time. Identity versus role confusion is a continuation of that, where we're learning that our parents aren't perfect and we're forging our own path. Intimacy versus isolation, which a young adult, sometimes known as the quarter life crisis, where we're trying to find ourselves and test out relationships. Generativity versus stagnation. Adulthood, this often happens, I guess you could say midlife crisis. Are we doing the same things over and over again? How do we keep life fresh? And then ego integrity versus despair in old age. Does my life have meaning? Did I waste my life? Etc. Okay. In the adolescent brain, the prefrontal cortex does not reach maturity until mid-20s. So there are some addiction theorists that believe that using as an adolescent can be particularly damaging because, and again, this is another theory, that addiction follows the pathways learning in the brain and that you can actually stunt your brain or cause certain parts of it not to be able to develop completely because of drug use, depending on the frequency and, of course, what drug it is. We know that the brain is not fully developed, and we know this because of MRI scans of the adolescent brain, and the brain develops from the inside out. Right? So this is why there can be a cognitive disconnect, especially in regards to impulsivity and decision making. Okay. Teenage drinking use is particularly problematic because it is one of the leading causes of teen death when it is coupled with driving. The number one cause of adolescent death is car accidents, and alcohol can play a role in that. So here we have identity versus role confusion. Alcohol is the drug of choice by American teens aged 12 to 17, and that is largely because it is legal and easy to get. We're currently seeing a trend where we're having a lot less tobacco use by teens. And then drinking and smoking is more prevalent in Europe, in the US, and that's largely due to policy. All right. And we're going to see differences here based off of countries and geography. So, for example, in Argentina, if you would have an exchange student in the US, there's no drinking age. Wine or beer and supper is part of the culture. Drinking is social, and the point of it is not to get drunk. That's one of the things that we can look at is intention, set and setting. What is the intention? Is the intention to have dinner with friends, or is the intention to drink? Okay. So one of the things that we can look at with different countries is the attitude of alcohol use in a family system. We can focus on moderation and adult supervision. In this country, however, adults can be arrested for providing alcohol to minors if they have the attitude of, oh, I'd rather them drink in the house than if they were to get caught, etc. Okay. So in continuing with our developmental theme, looking at the role of parents who are incarcerated, there is stigma if a child has a parent who is incarcerated. There's 3 times the odds that children will engage in antisocial or delinquent behavior, violence, or drug abuse. Negative outcomes include children and adults, school failure, and unemployment, and twice the odds of developing serious mental health problems. And because we incarcerate people at a disproportionate rate, we're going to see this more with people of color. I would like to say, though, on the other side of this, there are some fantastic programs to encourage healthy parenting and communication between incarcerated parents and children. Girl Scouts Beyond Bars is one of them, and there are some fantastic literacy programs as well. With the Girl Scout programs, kids can actually go camp out in the prison with their parents. So looking at differences between European youth versus United States youth, we have a prevalence of drunkenness highest in Western Europe, lowest in the Mediterranean countries, which is very interesting. Okay. Ireland versus Italy as well. Okay. So one of the things that we can look at too is what types of alcohol are being used. Is it distilled? Is it fermented? Remember that the potency makes a big difference. Are we drinking whiskey or are we drinking wine? They're not the same. Okay. And then you'll see that driving ages are a little bit different here. Okay. One moment. Okay. We have higher smoking rates for adolescents with Europeans at 15 to 16. The Mediterranean moderate drinking pattern is argued as being more helpful than the abstinent only, don't drink, right? Because we know if we tell people not to do something, they're going to do something. Whereas if we make something less taboo, then in the beginning, and this is very important, in the beginning if something is legalized, we're going to see a spike in use. However, that's going to even out. And so it's important not to have policy that responds to the spike. Okay. 22, let's see. Okay. And then we have illicit drug use in Europe is half of that in the U.S. Okay? And if you look at the U.S., we have policies and things that kind of are hackneyed, for lack of a better word. And if you look at the drinking age, 21, versus our driving age, 16, versus our voting age, 18, versus the age you can get car insurance, 25. And it's interesting. So if you look at some of these other countries, driving is not allowed until age 18, which could impact car accidents. A SAMHSA household survey reported that cigarette use was 11.6% with 12 to 17-year-olds in 2010, and binge drinking was reported by 17% of youth age 16 to 17. So just as a reminder, binge drinking is when a male has 5 to 6 drinks within a 2-hour period of time, and a female has 4 to 5 drinks within a 2-hour period of time. It's important to remember that it doesn't. So if someone says, how much do you drink, and you drink 4 or 5 drinks a day, that's not necessarily a binge if it's spread out over time. Okay. At age 21, around half of people aged 21 are binge drinkers. And a lot of people, it's estimated that up to 80% of 21-year-olds could meet the criteria for alcoholism, but most people do outgrow that. Around half people are binge drinkers. Heavy drinkers tend to have high drug using rates as well. Okay. And in this survey, some of the past month alcohol use for 2020, 12 to 20 were 16.1% among Asians, 20.4% among Blacks. So we do have a lower rate here, which was explained in a previous chapter. 22% among American Indians or Alaska Natives, 25.1% among Hispanics, and 27.5% among those who were reporting 2 or more races. So there's an increase here. And then 30% among whites. Ages 18 to 25, 21.2% of surveyed people had illicit drug use during the past month, and around half of all youths had used alcohol. And the racial breakdown for drugs is not given for youth in 2009, but previous surveys show higher rates for Black than white kids. American Indians that were the highest. So another way to get information about adolescent youth would be through the ER and for school surveys. Use of alcohol, which is by far the most dangerous drug, so we have to look at, and I know that we look at opiates and heroin and methamphetamine when we're in crises, but we forget about alcohol, and it does account for the most deaths, second to nicotine, right? Car crashes and drownings are particularly risky for adolescent youth. Okay. And one of the surveys, almost all current smokers also drink alcohol. Remember that there is a biological base for that. School surveys illustrate that African American and Latino seniors have rates of illicit drug use lower than that of whites. But the reverse of that is true among 8th graders. So that's interesting. So there's certainly a familial and cultural influence there. Okay. And then it shouldn't be surprising that ER visits are mainly for alcohol. Okay. However, we have seen a rise in pain-killing drugs, such as OxyContin. And again, something that's legal and easy to get. You can just get them in medicine cabinets. Okay. So looking at this from a business angle, it's estimated that there's $10 billion of alcohol consumed by those that are under 21. And it shouldn't be surprising that beer and liquor companies have a lot of funding, as do tobacco companies. 80% of adult smokers start as children, so there's a huge incentive there. Many years ago, they would have cartoon characters that would smoke. You might be able to find the old cartoon ads of Wilma and Fred Flintstone smoking, and they would advertise cigarettes within cartoons. And then you see in the 80s, like with She-Ra and G.I. Joe, there was a huge shift there where a lot of the cartoons had messages at the end of each show that were conscientious. Okay. We see a lot of marketing of casinos, and many casinos give free alcohol if you spend time there, so we see that. Okay. And then 63 to 82% of teenagers, we're talking 12 to 17-year-olds, gamble each year. 4 to 7% of teens exhibit serious patterns of disordered gambling. And a lot of this is done over the internet. Yes, you need to be over 18, but nobody knows if you have a parent's credit card or somebody's credit card. You can just click yes and enter the credit card information in. Tobacco companies have been targeting kids for a very long time, and there are ads for smokeless tobacco. So we have seen an increase with vaping among teens. Okay. And again, anytime that we have an increase in technology, we're going to see a rise in certain patterns. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we have video poker, slot machines, and of course the lottery. And earlier chapters in your book talk about the history of when things were legal or illegal. Okay. And it's probably not a surprise that strenuous exercise helped to reduce smoking. One, because you don't have the lung capacity to do that. Team sports can be a great incentive for youth to not smoke. And I know we've challenged the idea of, is there such thing as a gateway drug? Some do consider smoking to be a gateway drug. So risks for substance misuse include ADHD, trauma in early childhood, and poor role models, and also perhaps seeing people use. Okay. Sexual abuse leads to a sense of shame and could lead to acting out. Trauma does change brain chemistry. If you look at pictures of brain trauma, they're in the same part of the brain that addiction is, and there are these little nodules that form. And you can actually see it. It's a physical change that happens. And it abuses the ability to cope with stress. And we know that substances can be beneficial until they become detrimental for helping with stress. We have an influence of high stress and drinking found in juvenile mouse studies. Okay, and I believe that really this is a good argument for assertiveness training and resiliency training. Other risk factors for use can include turbulent teen-father relationships, particularly with girls, child abuse and other trauma. So again, trauma does change the brain and makes us more vulnerable. So it's very important to learn healthy coping skills. Starting smoking early is a risk factor for other substances. We have pretty even gender for girls and boys smoking, but a lower rate among African American girls, which may have to do with culture and parenting. It is no surprise that we have media-generated weight obsession, which is a major problem among girls of European American ethnicity, and more with males as well. And then we can add body dysmorphic disorder and muscle dysmorphic disorder in there as well. And we talked about orthorexia, which is an obsession with clean eating. And eating disorders are very closely related to obsessive compulsive disorders and are characterized by rituals. And looking at studies from Scandinavia, those a higher risk would be girls who cry easily when teased or anxious and shy. They might find it easier to cope with substances. That would put us at a higher risk. Male aggression around age 8 predicted alcoholism 18 to 20 years later, which is quite interesting. And there are associations with oppositional defiant disorder. So children are diagnosed with ODD, and then many children that are diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder are later diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. You can't be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as a child, right? And vice versa. Okay. So things that we're looking at are high novelty seeking, high risks, low harm avoidance. So daredevil type things, feeling that they might be invincible. Okay. And these traits can predict early onset alcoholism. And for both sexes, poor school success predicted later drinking problems as well. So school success and involvement in school programs is a protective factor. Girls who were sexually abused are 3 times more likely than other girls to develop drinking problems later on. Boys who were sexually abused are more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder, dysthymia, and ADHD. Abused girls are more likely to be diagnosed with PTSD and major depression. Risks for girls specifically include daughters of alcoholics are increased risk for alcoholism and also tend to marry partners that are alcoholic. Teenage girls who are heavy drinkers are 5 times more likely to engage in sexual intercourse, which shouldn't be a surprise because it lowers inhibitions. 1/3 less likely to use condoms because it lowers inhibitions, and more likely to practice unsafe sex because it lowers inhibitions, and we don't always make the best decisions when we were intoxicated. Okay. Risks for boys include those that have been abused by priests have higher alcohol use rates, which would make sense. And there have been incidences where priests use alcohol as grooming and to subdue their victims. One of the biggest threats to life and health for adolescent boys is alcohol-related accidents. Again, drowning, car accidents, hitting their head, jumping off of roofs, etc. Okay. Muscle dysmorphia is where you saw this in the film. The man whose arm exploded, he just kept wanting to go bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's a disconnect between how the person views themselves and what they actually look like. Okay. Dysmorphia is a diagnosis in DSM, in the eating disorder category. Obsessive bodybuilding can be a major problem for young males, as we saw in the film, and there's a follow-up film to that in which they're looking at a young boy who's about 13 and he's kind of starting on that road. Right. We know that anabolic steroids are very, very popular, and if you look at bodybuilders, you can tell who's using natural bodybuilding methods and then who's using steroids because the muscles start to be in shapes that are not naturally occurring. And it's estimated that steroids are used by 2.7% of male high school seniors. There are many side effects to steroids, but some of those include stunted growth, acne, and shrinking testicles. College students in a traditional setting, so those that are 18 to 22 or so, go away from home, especially those that live in the dorm, are at a particularly unique risk. There was a case of a college pledge in Colorado who died of an overdose, and the police weren't called out of fear of under 21 drinking laws. A law passed in 1984. So there are also laws in different states about this that would protect the person that makes the phone call. Okay. Right. In the 1980s, a law was passed to curb drinking and driving deaths. And that was the role of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's RAD, Recording Artists Against Drunk Driving. In a 2010 SAMHSA survey, they found that 63.3% of college students were current drinkers, 42.1% were binge drinkers, so there's our definition again, and 15.6% were heavy drinkers. They drank 5 or more times. Okay. And then we have a risk of age 21 birthday celebration. So one of the other arguments for drinking in moderation is to teach people about tolerance and what their limits are. Is if people are not experienced with different types of alcohol or their physiology or how to eat and drink, etc., they can be at a big risk, especially for alcohol poisoning. We know that a lot of sexual assaults occur under the influence of alcohol. The Amethyst Initiative was 120 college presidents signed a statement to consider revising under 21 drinking laws. MAD noted that lives saved from 1982 to 1998, there were 61% fewer fatal crashes under 21 and a 56% decrease among 21 to 24-year-olds. It might not have been the result of the drinking laws that were passed, started in 1984. There were seatbelt regulations around that time and stricter drinking and driving laws. Okay. College and binge drinking is a particular issue. The U.S. government imposed nationwide minimum drinking age of 21 in the 80s to attempt to curtail drunken driving by youth. Fewer drink today, but those who do drink more. So remember that it's the minority of people that use the majority of substances, and that's true for cocaine, that's true for alcohol. Party till you puke signs were once posted on university campuses. We're not seeing that as much. And there are clean and sober dorms where people can intentionally live. Some treatment centers actually own some by colleges, Hazelden in particular. However, there are colleges that have designated clean and sober housing for students that would like that. Critics argue that students are driven to partying underground and away from faculty supervision, which is kind of an interesting thing because, on our campus, I would also think that it's pretty inappropriate for professors to be partying with students. So I'm not quite sure what this means. Plus, I guess you could argue that, if people were drinking, we might see that. But, I'm not sure if that would really make a difference because if we notice someone's intoxicated during class, that's one thing. So I'm not exactly sure what they're trying to get here, but it's an interesting perspective. Okay. Alan Marlatt encourages that we have new campaigns for moderate drinking. So again, binge drinking isn't moderate drinking, and it would be important for people to learn this. Moderation management is a great thing to do, and it's got to be taught. It's a skill that can be taught. In the past, social norms campaign with messages of moderation were unsuccessful. Okay. So harm reduction is really important. Um, College newspapers were slow to restrict enticing beer ads. And I remember being in college where there were ads where, oh, get paid to drink beer for some type of psychology experiment. And you might see that around. Most binge drinkers mature out of wild drinking in the early adulthood, which is true. But over 1,800 college students die each year from alcohol related injuries. And then, of course, we have rape and unsafe sex practices. Okay. For cigarettes, because of the capture ratio, meaning it has a high capture ratio. Capture ratio is the percentage of people that get addicted to a drug when they try it. Abstinence probably is going to be better here. And you will hear people say, oh, I only smoke when I drink, but that there's a biological reason for that. You can drink more. It lowers your BAC. Okay. So they describe two paths to drug use by youth, striving to be cool and then using drugs to escape. So we have perhaps some peer pressure or an image, and then the escapism, which is, of course, correlated with some things that we saw earlier, like trauma and coping. Okay. Messages about long-term damage aren't really going to have a lot of impact, and that's partly because of how the teenage brain works and how it develops. Right. We know that adolescents don't have the best capacity for decision making because their brain has not yet been developed. So in 402, we talk a lot more about drug courts. Drug court programs are very important for families. There are felony versions of them, and there are family versions of them through CPS. It's closely supervised treatment, and through CPS, the goal is reunification. An example of harm reduction would be not having happy hours, which are usually in the middle of the day. So if you think about the times for happy hours right before dinner, 3 to 6 or 2 to 6, and then there's a lot of traffic at those times. So if people are driving home intoxicated during rush hour, that's not fantastic. And then there are a lot of bars that do free drinks on your 21st birthday, which can lead to alcohol poisoning. Okay. Another example of harm reduction would be lowering the drinking age laws in favor of moderation and having it less taboo in the culture, and discourage the drinking of hard liquor in favor of beer and wine. Okay. We can also encourage adult supervision with kids who are drinking and encourage moderate drinking as with meals, which would mean that laws would have to change because, again, you can be arrested with giving alcohol to a minor. But families that do this, they generally tend to have less problems with it. And again, looking at the European model. And if alcohol is served with food, then we're going to have a healthier time. Okay. Motivational principles from social psychology have been very helpful here. In The Social Animal from Elliot Aronson, he states that if you state a position, you will be wedded to it. A small commitment to take action goes a long way. So stating an intention, right? Making small steps. People with high self-esteem can easier resist temptation. Work toward a goal might pay off eventually. A change of attitude can help, and people desire to reduce distance. So here we really have the stages of change stated in a different way. Miller and Rollinick, whom you've heard a lot about now, have their motivational interviewing strategies, and they work very well with teenagers. So things that we want to avoid are a premature focus, such as on the client's addictive behavior. And one of the things that we do is we separate the self-worth of the person away from the symptoms. Being confrontational between the therapist and client over denial is not helpful, and it's considered something that was an older model of treatment. We have to be careful of labeling, forcing the individual to accept a label, alcoholic or addict, and that's why some people are a little shy about 12 steps. And then the blaming trap, which is the fallacy that is especially pronounced in couples counseling. Right? Playing the blame game. And in reality, if we're looking at Bowen family systems, which is very helpful with addiction, we're all responding to what's going on in the family. So if somebody becomes sober, the family's going to respond to that. If somebody has a boundary, the family's going to respond to that, etc. Primary prevention. As we talked about earlier, child abuse and early prevention education and treatment programs, because we have to start early. And prevention and intervention aren't linear. So prevention and intervention can actually be cyclical, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference because they can be one and the same and serve the same function. So for example, starting early, smoking education to keep youths from ever starting to smoke, health and skill education at schools, and some of the best prevention programs don't even mention drugs, but it's more about assertive training and setting goals. One thing that we can do is reduce ads promoting addictive behavior and advocacy for the hiring of more school counselors and social workers. I think we can all get on board with that. So looking at stage-specific motivational statements in the stage of change, the first stage is pre-contemplation. And our goal would be to establish a professional rapport with our client, which is built upon empathy. The counselor reinforces the discrepancies here. So an adolescent might say, my parents can't tell me what to do. I still use and I don't see the harm in it. Do you? Okay. So if we were looking at this, we would explore the person's feelings about this. But here you can see that they're in the pre-contemplation stage because they don't see the harm in it. Okay. And they don't want to change their behavior. The next stage of change is contemplation. And a counselor might say, how is life better before drug use? And they might say, well, my parents bugged me less, or life at home was less stressful. Okay. We can emphasize choices. And questions here are going to be framed around the utility. So what do you get out of drinking? And then what's the downside? Okay, so what we're really doing here is promoting dialogue. Resistance is absolutely inevitable. It used to be called denial. It's rich information. So if a person is resistant, it means they're hesitant, right? And we can work on that. It's a good thing. Miller advises to roll with it, don't challenge it, and use reflective summarizing. Also in the contemplation stage, an adolescent may say, I'm on top of the world when I'm high, but then when I come down, I'm really down. It was better before I got started on these things. Okay, so now we're looking at, okay, I am seeing pros and cons, and I am beginning to see how my life was before and after. In the preparation stage of change, we're preparing to make change. So one thing that people do when they're quitting cigarettes is they might have a quit date, right? Or they might say, no, I'm going to go to treatment in 2 weeks. A danger here, though, is people might binge during that time and overdo it, and overdoses might happen. Okay. So we could set the date and have a collaborative dialogue with the person. What do you think will work for you? And the adolescent might say, I'm feeling good about setting a date to quit, but who knows? Okay. And that's okay to have uncertainty. In the action stage, the person is starting to live those changes. A comment might look like, staying clean may be healthy, but it sure makes for a dull life. Maybe I'll check out some of those groups. Therapists might say, why don't you look at what others have done in this situation? Okay. And then help them with an appropriate group, and also brainstorm different things they can do. In the maintenance, the person is living the changes, and we might have to adjust things a little bit. A comment might look like, it's been a few months, I'm not there yet, but I'm hanging out with some new friends. Okay. And then some models of this have termination or relapse. We look at relapse specifically in 401 and how it's not the end of the world, and we look at the different types of relapse. Okay. Now we're going to look at gender specifics. So for girls, equality does not necessarily mean the same. So we want to look at equity versus equality, because everybody is not equal. So how can we do things so that things are equitable? Right. So an example of this, there's a great cartoon where there's a fence, and there's a tall person that can see over the fence and a short person that can't see over the fence. and a medium-sized person who can barely see over the fence. So the fence is the equal height, but equity would mean giving the two shorter people a stepping stool to step on so that they can be at the same height as the taller person who is already there. Okay. Programs for girls are much more successful when they focus on relationships, especially interpersonal relationships. Okay. Girls are very social. Okay. Life skills is really important. Competency is very important, and that is one of the 6 recipes for recovery, if you remember from the first chapter, identifying as a competent human being. Okay. Problems in middle adulthood can be relapse. We have a lot of life transitions that happen around this time. So we'll have divorces, marriages, children, second careers, etc. So the impact of a baby boom generation, illicit drug use doubled in 2002 to 2007 in the over 50 age group, and this is still occurring. We still are having a rising issue with addiction in the baby boomers. 6.6% use illicit drugs over age 26. Most is marijuana, but remember that it's not illicit in every state now. And it's estimated that 10.8% of pregnant women drink and 1 in 6 smoke. We have particular risks for substance abuse in combat veterans. Most problems of VA clients with substance abuse and PTSD in the younger age group, but 11% are older. Trauma is very common. PTSD among female veterans who were sexually victimized, about 15%. So it really also depends on how it was handled, but we know that this is a big problem for female veterans and female service members. More is absolutely being done with the military. I would say it's much more proactive than it was even maybe 5 to 10 years ago. Okay. And there needs to be a control of marketing of alcohol and cigarettes to soldiers. Okay. And sometimes we look at the culture of alcohol and cigarettes and how it might be used as a tool or as a reward. On the books in the Navy, still today on the books, you got a rum ration, but that was back in the day where the water wasn't clean to drink. Right? In the older days when you could smoke in psychiatric hospitals, they would give cigarettes to patients, and now they can't do that. So now we have a lot of overweight patients at psychiatric hospitals because food might be a reward. All right. Substance abuse among older adults. 13% of the U.S. population is over age 65. We have more men with alcohol problems, but that's across the board. And with any substance, really. Older adults consume 20 to 25% of all prescription medications, which is quite stunning. And then we see the 2 types of alcoholism, which were talked about earlier on in this book as well, early and late onset. So early onset is more severe levels of depression and anxiety, so that might also be linked with juvenile delinquency. It might be more lasting. Late onset is typically in response to an environmental change. Okay. Older adults consume less alcohol than the young. Part of that is the novelty wears off. 5.2% over the age of 50 used an illicit drug in the past year. 9.1% smoke. There's a trend toward nursing homes for short-term alcoholism rehabilitation because they have more room. Okay. So you might be seeing people in their even 20 and 30s going to rehab. Many ex-male alcoholics reside in nursing homes. Okay. Drinking patterns in older adults. They tend to drink smaller amounts at one time and misuse drugs prescribed by doctors and experience a hidden alcohol problem. And drink in connection with a number of late life stresses, including bereavement and loss of occupational roles. And so then we really see isolation happening. Okay. Again, I sent a report from 2010. 1 out of 8 persons over the age of 50 sought help for substance use in 2008. Their share of treatment admissions doubled between 1992 and 2008. Primary substance use problems were with alcohol, heroin, and cocaine. And many late onset drug users had problems with prescription medications. Speaking for myself, the oldest client that I ever had was an 80-year-old female, and she had had a surgery, and the drug of choice was prescription pills, and her family was very concerned because she had previously been a very active person and she was in good health in her 80s. She came to rehab and did very, very well. All right. More fun facts. Many early onset suffer from Korsakoff syndrome and other alcohol-related neurological problems. Medical complications can include hip fracture. You remember that alcohol affects our balance, suicide, and brain damage. Late onset, we have more women here, and close family ties. Okay. And remember that if the elderly are using 20 to 25% of all of our prescription medications, a lot of these medications should not be mixed with alcohol. And they're doing a little bit better with it now, but there can be prescription interactions that are not caught, and that is another risk for older adults, the mixing of many medications. And then when we add alcohol on top of that, there's more risk there. Okay. So in counseling older clients, we want to look at our life stages there. Okay. Do we have age segregated or mixed ages in treatment? It's kind of interesting, and a lot of that is going to depend upon your setting. And there might be support groups for like 55 and older. There might be groups like that at rehab as well, but a lot of places just don't have the resources for that. Guidelines for work in groups with elderly: avoid strong language and rebuilding supporting systems. Okay, so we might swear, or we might be mirroring our adolescent and young adult clients, but we want to look at some of those attending behavioral skills and mirror our older clients. And we want to keep the pace slow with measurable, attainable, reasonable goals. So relapse prevention. We teach older clients to learn the warning signs and high-risk events, review feelings that lead to relapse so they can be avoided, and we talked about hungry, angry, lonely, tired as something that could help us to recognize when we might be at risk for a relapse. Okay. Critical thinking skills are very important and help clients renew their commitment to sobriety. A lot of this is, oh my gosh, I'm so old, my age, and I did this again. And we want to get that person out of the cycle of shame and guilt there and just help them move forward. Find effective coping styles, because it's not going to be the same at every life stage. Build support systems, and remember that a non-confrontational approach is the best, and I would believe that that goes all the way across the board now. Okay. Counselor pitfalls. We might anticipate feelings of guilt and shame in older clients in trouble with the law. We have to be careful of ageism. So countertransference is where the counselor puts their feelings onto the client. Transference is where the client puts their feelings onto the counselor. And in some schools of counseling, like psychodynamic counseling, transference is encouraged, but countertransference can be an ethical issue. So for example, let's say that you have a client that looks like your grandmother and you love your grandmother. You might be more lenient with them. You might give her more leeway than somebody else. Let's say that you don't like your grandmother and this lady looks like your grandmother. You might be harsher. You might not provide the same level of empathy or professional services. Okay. So we have to be careful about denial and assessment and having sympathy and not empathy. And this is one thing that happens too is as people age, it's almost like they go through a social process where they're compared to children. Oh, look at that cute old couple. And we downplay the wisdom and everything, and don't actually look at, who they are. They're kind of hidden by their age. So we have to be very careful about looking at our own attitudes and feelings about age. Loss and grief in family members of addicted persons. There's different types of guilt, survival guilt. If two people have been through a trauma and one person has more resilience and they go through it and the other person doesn't, that person that survived might feel really guilty. There can be helplessness to deal with our loved ones, and then ambivalence, or maybe even anger and hostility. The SAMHSA definition of spirituality is very simple. It's just a feeling of being connected to something higher than oneself. It doesn't have to do anything with religion. So the key word here is connectedness, and encouraging our clients to find something that they can connect to outside of themselves that can bring meaning. And then we have 12-step programs, which are very widely available, and a lot of people like them, but there are also some really great alternatives from 12 steps as well that you are aware of now. We do look at spiritual healing in Dimension 6 of ASAM, and social work education stresses the importance of helping clients find their own spiritual meaning. And again, that might be within an organized religion, it might not be. Older adults often change their outlook as they look back on their lives and they seek the meaning of life. A higher power is the nature. It might be nature in Norway and Native American traditions. Some people think it's music. It's whatever makes that person feel connected. And there might be a search for forgiveness and renewal. And 12 steps can be a guide to self-knowledge. Right. Thank you so much for hanging in there.